Okay, have you ever really truly stopped to think about how we know things? I mean, how do we actually know what we know? It's a huge question, and today we're going on a journey to explore an idea that totally revolutionized how we think about learning itself. It's called constructivism, and it all kicks off with one simple but profound question.
Right. This is the heart of it. Is knowledge just something that's out there, waiting for us to find it, like a cool rock on the beach? Or is it something we actually build, piece by piece, inside our own heads? How you answer that question leads to two completely different ways of looking at the human mind.
For a long, long time, the common view was that the mind is basically a mirror. It just passively reflects the world exactly as it is. Simple. But constructivism comes along with this totally radical idea. What if the mind isn't a mirror at all? What if it's an architect, actively designing and building our personal version of reality? And the very first blueprints for this wild idea came from a philosopher back in the 18th century.
And that philosopher was the one and only Immanuel Kant. Now, he stepped into the middle of a massive philosophical food fight. The big question was, does all our knowledge come from our senses and experiences, or does it come from pure, logical reason? His answer? Well, it changed everything.
So you had these two camps. On one side were the empiricists. They said we're all born as blank slates, and every single thing we know comes through our five senses. On the other side were the rationalists, who argued that no, real, true knowledge comes from pure logic. It's something we figure out in our heads, separate from the messy outside world. Kant looked at this standoff and basically said, you know what, you're both half right.
And this was his genius move. He said, look, the empiricists are right. Experience gives us the raw materials, the sights, the sounds, the feelings. But the mind isn't just a passive bucket collecting all this stuff. It provides the form, the structure. It actively organizes that chaos into something that makes sense. So, how on earth does it do that?
Well, Kant came up with this idea of categories of understanding. The best way to think about them is like the pre-installed software for your brain. Concepts like space, time, cause and effect. Kant argued these aren't things we learn from the world, they're the tools the mind uses to build the world. Without this software, all our experiences would be just a meaningless blur of light and noise.
So the big takeaway from Kant is this powerful shift in thinking. The mind isn't a passive mirror, it's an active architect. The world we experience isn't just the world as is, it's the world as our mind has constructed it for us. Now, this was a philosophical bombshell, but it took over a century for a scientist to come along and see how this architect actually learns and improves its blueprints over time. And that brings us to the 20th century, and to a brilliant thinker named Jean Piaget. He basically took Kant's philosophical blueprint and started watching it come to life in real time by studying the most amazing architects of all, children.
And this is a really crucial leap. See, Kant talked about the mind structure as if it was this fixed, universal thing. Piaget, by actually observing kids, realized this structure isn't static at all. It grows, it changes, it evolves. Where Kant saw a finished building, Piaget saw a bustling construction site that's always a work in progress.
Here's a perfect example. Piaget would see a child say something like, "My shadow follows me because it likes me." Now, most people would just say, "Oh, that's cute, but wrong." But Piaget saw something much deeper. He didn't see an error. He saw a tiny scientist creating a theory. It was a perfectly logical explanation based on the data the child had at the time.
Piaget figured out that this mental construction happens in a cycle. First, there's assimilation. That's when we take a new experience and try to fit it into a box we already have. A toddler sees a cat and says doggy because it has 4 legs and fur. But then comes accommodation. That's the moment the doggy meows and it doesn't fit the box. The toddler is forced to change their mental model, maybe create a new cat box. And equilibration is just the process of finding that new balance, creating a more stable, more accurate understanding of the world. It's this constant dance of building, testing, and rebuilding.
And he actually mapped this whole developmental journey out into 4 major stages. You can really see the progression here. We start by building a sense of reality through our senses, learning that a toy still exists even when you hide it. Then we build on top of that with language and symbols. Then we build the ability to think logically, and finally, we can construct purely abstract ideas. Each stage is literally built on the foundation of the one before it.
So what did all this mean for the real world? The implications were just enormous. If knowledge is something we build, not something we just receive, then that changes absolutely everything about how we should teach and how we should learn.
You have to remember, the dominant idea before this was behaviorism.
This model saw the learner as a passive vessel, an empty bucket you just pour facts into. But constructivism comes along and flips the entire script. It says, no, the learner isn't a bucket. The learner is the builder, the active agent in charge of their own education.
And of course, this completely changes what it means to be a teacher. You're no longer the sage on the stage, the all-knowing expert who just dispenses information. Instead, you become the guide on the side. Your job is to create interesting problems and rich environments that challenge students to build their own understanding.
This also gives us a new way to think about truth itself. For a constructivist, the goal isn't to have a perfect one-to-one copy of reality in your head. That's probably impossible. The goal is to have an adaptive model, a way of understanding that works, that helps you predict things and navigate the world successfully. Knowledge is judged by how useful it is.
And the legacy of these ideas is absolutely everywhere today. It influenced countless other thinkers in education. Modern cognitive science basically confirms the core ideas. And get this, we even see the same logic in artificial intelligence. A neural network makes a guess. That's assimilation. When it's wrong, it adjusts its own internal wiring to do better next time. That is accommodation, happening in silicon. It proves that learning isn't a straight ladder you climb once. It's a spiral where you keep revisiting ideas, but each time with a deeper and more powerful understanding.
So if we had to boil this entire intellectual journey down to one sentence, it would be this. The real goal of education isn't just to transmit a bunch of facts. It's to cultivate thinkers. It's to give people the tools and the confidence they need to become architects of their own understanding.
So from Kant's idea of a mind that structures reality to Piaget's discovery of a mind that grows through experience, we see that learning is one of the most fundamental acts of human creation. And that leaves us all with a really simple but powerful question to ask ourselves. If learning is building, what are you building today? Today we're going to talk about a guy who completely changed the way we think about, well, thinking. His name was Jean Piaget, and he wasn't just a psychologist, he was more like an architect of the human mind.
So let me ask you a question. Is intelligence something you're just born with? You know, like a fixed thing, something you get at birth, like your eye color? For a long, long time, that's what most people believed. But what if there's more to the story?
Well, Piaget came along and pretty much turned that whole idea on its head. He argued that intelligence isn't some static thing we have, but a dynamic system we actively build through our experiences. And that one simple idea, it's at the heart of everything. And this brings us to his big, game-changing theory, cognitive constructivism. It's a fancy term, but the idea behind it would completely reshape education and psychology forever.
So what is it? At its core, cognitive constructivism is the idea that we're not just empty buckets waiting for someone to pour knowledge into our heads. Nope, we are the builders. We're the architects of our own understanding, actively putting the pieces together every single day.
The best way to get this is to imagine your mind as a busy construction site. Every little thing you experience, every conversation you have, every problem you solve, it's like a new brick, a new tool that helps you build a bigger, better, more complex understanding of the world around you.
Okay, so if our minds are construction sites, how exactly does the building happen? What are the tools? Well, Piaget said our minds use two key tools to get the job done.
The first tool he called assimilation. This is basically our brain's first attempt to make sense of something new by trying to cram it into a mental box or a category that we already have.
For instance, imagine a little kid who have a mental box for dog. You know, 4 legs, it's furry, has a tail. The first time they see a cat, what do? They point and yell, "Doggy!" They're assimilating. They're trying to make it fit what they already know. And honestly, it makes total sense.
But what happens when that new piece of info just doesn't fit? Well, that's where the second tool, accommodation, comes into play. This is when we're forced to adjust our thinking, to actually change or create a whole new mental box.
So when someone gently corrects the child and says, "No, sweetie, that's a cat, see? It meows," they have to accommodate. They can't just keep stuffing it into the doggy box. They have to build a brand new box labeled cat. Just like that, their mental blueprint of the world got a little more detailed. Here's another way to think about it. Assimilation is like having only a hammer and trying to use it for everything, even screws. Accommodation is realizing, hey, I need a screwdriver, and getting a new tool for the job. It's this constant dance between these two that allows our knowledge to grow.
So how does this whole construction project unfold over a person's life? Well, Piaget noticed it wasn't random. He saw that it happens in very distinct phases. He mapped out 4 major stages of cognitive development, kind of like a series of evolving blueprints for how we think.
It all starts with the sensory motor stage. This is babies learning about the world by literally touching and tasting everything. This is when they figure out that even when they can't see their favorite toy, it still exists. Next up is the pre-operational stage. Language and imagination just explode, but their thinking is still very self-centered. It's why a 5-year-old might hide from you by just covering their own eyes, because if they can't see you, you can't see them, right? Then we hit the concrete operational stage, where kids get really logical about physical stuff. They can sort things, they can understand that 8 small slices of pizza is the same amount as 4 big ones. And finally, we reach the formal operational stage. This is where abstract thought kicks in. We can start to grapple with big ideas like justice, morality, and what-if scenarios. Each stage is a total upgrade of our mental operating system.
Now, to make this really clear, let's look at one of Piaget's most brilliant and famous experiments. It's called the conservation task. So imagine a child is sitting at a table, and you show them 2 identical glasses, short and wide, with the exact amount of water. You ask them, are they the same? And they agree, yep, they're the same. But then, while they're watching, you take one of those glasses and pour all the water into a new container, a tall, skinny one. The water level is obviously way higher now. And then you ask the crucial question, okay, which glass has more water now? And this is where the magic happens. A younger kid, one who's in that pre-operational stage, will almost always point to the tall glass and say, that one has more. Why? Because their thinking is dominated by what they see, and the water level is higher. But an older kid, one in the concrete operational stage, will look at you like you're crazy and say, it's the same amount. They can mentally reverse the action. They know you didn't add or subtract any water. It's not that the younger kid is wrong, it just shows this incredible qualitative leap in their thinking process.
So what? Well, this has massive implications. If children are actually constructing their own knowledge piece by piece, what on earth does that mean for teachers? Piaget's theory completely redefines what it means to teach.
Think about the old model of a classroom. The teacher stands at the front and basically just dispenses facts, right? But in a constructivist classroom, the teacher's role completely flips. They're no longer the lecturer. They become a facilitator, a guide, a co-explorer, helping kids discover things for themselves.
So instead of just giving answers, this kind of teacher is busy posing challenging questions that make students think. They're designing these rich learning environments. They're encouraging kids to argue and collaborate with each other. The whole goal is not to give them the answer, but to help them build the path to find it on their own.
So why does all of this still matter so much today? Because Piaget's ideas weren't just some dusty old theory. They created a lasting blueprint that continues to shape our world in very real ways.
Just look at any modern school. The whole idea of hands-on, active learning, that's Piaget. Inquiry-based science labs or kids experiment, Piaget. Kids working together on group projects, Piaget. The very idea that you should teach things that are developmentally appropriate for a child's age, you guessed it, that all comes directly from his work.
And his influence doesn't even stop at the classroom door. His work is absolutely foundational for developmental neuroscience, the study of how our brains physically change as we learn. And get this, even modern AI models, the ones that learn and adapt on their own, in a way, they're using Piaget's principles of assimilation and accommodation to get smarter.
And this quote from the man himself really just captures the entire spirit of his philosophy. The goal of education isn't to create perfect copies of the past, but to empower people to become innovators, to be creators, to do new things.
And that really leaves us with one final thought. If intelligence isn't something we're just given, but something we build, well, that puts all the power right back into our own hands. So the real question is, what are you building today?
Have you ever stopped to think about how you, think? We often imagine learning as a solo mission, but what if that's all wrong? What if our minds are actually built with and by the people around us? Today, we're diving into that exact idea, how we literally build one another's minds. Right? You see it all the time. The classic image of a learner is someone sitting alone, poring over a book, lost in thought. But is that the whole story? What if real, meaningful learning is less like a solo hike and more like a team sport? Something that happens in the space between people? Well, there's a name for this idea, and it's a game changer. It's called social constructivism. And the guy behind it, a brilliant psychologist named Lev Vygotsky, argued that knowledge isn't some treasure you just stumble upon. Nope, it's something we build brick by brick together through our conversations, our culture, and our communities. So let's get right to the heart of Vygotsky's big idea. He believed that learning is all about taking the outside world and bringing it inside. Everything we learn starts as a shared social experience before it ever becomes a personal thought. Vygotsky himself said it perfectly. This quote right here, it's the key to everything. Just think about that for a second. Any skill, any idea, it first shows up between people, in a chat, a lesson, a shared task. Only after that does it settle in and become part of your own thinking. Learning literally moves from the outside in. Okay, so if learning moves from the outside in, how in the world does that actually happen? Vygotsky didn't just give us a cool theory, he gave us the mechanics, a kind of social learning toolkit. So let's crack it open and see what's inside. First up is this concept of mediation. The idea here is that we never just raw dog reality. We always use tools that act as a bridge between our minds and the world. You don't just see a bunch of trees, right? You use the idea of a forest to make sense of it all. These tools aren't just helpful, they fundamentally shape how we perceive and think. And these tools come in two main flavors. You've got your physical tools, a pencil, a computer, anything that helps you physically do stuff. But the real magic is in the psychological tools. Things like numbers, maps, symbols. And the undisputed champion, the most powerful psychological tool of all, you guessed it, language. Language lets us label, categorize, and organize the entire world into complex thought. And that brings us to Vygotsky's most famous concept, the zone of proximal development, or ZPD for short. Proximal just means nearby, or what's next. So the ZPD is that magical sweet spot. It's the gap between what you can do all by yourself and what you could do with just a little bit of help. It's the fertile ground where growth happens. Let's break it down. Zone 1 is the stuff you've already mastered. Zone 3 is the stuff that's way over your head for now. But Zone 2, that's where the magic happens. The ZPD is where a teacher or a friend can give you just enough support to stretch your abilities and turn potential into actual skill. Now, this is where it all comes together in a really profound way. If learning moves from the outside in, what does that mean for our inner voice? Vygotsky laid out this incredible journey of how social chatter literally becomes the silent voice inside our heads. It happens in 3 big steps. First, as babies, we use language to talk to other people. Then, as little kids, you see us doing private speech. We talk to ourselves out loud to figure things out. Okay, the blue piece goes here. Finally, that voice goes quiet. It turns inward and becomes our inner speech, that constant stream of consciousness we call thinking. Think about what this really means. The voice you hear inside your own head right now, it's literally the echo of past conversations. Your private thoughts were born out of public dialogue. That is a truly mind-bending idea. All right, this is all fantastic theory, but what does it look like on the ground? Let's check out a couple of real-world examples to see how Vygotsky's ideas are playing out all around us every single day. So picture this, a classic classroom. A teacher gives 2 little kids a puzzle that's just a bit too hard for either of them to do on their own. They're both stuck. For them, this puzzle is in that 3rd zone, what I can't do yet. But then, something amazing happens. They start talking to each other. Hey, what if you tried that piece over there? No, turn it around. Their conversation creates a shared mental space. They're working inside each other's zone of proximal development, using language as the ultimate tool to solve a problem neither could solve alone. And there's a name for that kind of help, scaffolding. Just like the scaffolding on a building, this support system helps a learner reach new heights. And this is key. Once the skill is built, you take the scaffold away. The learner can now do it on their own. Now, you might be thinking, this Vygotsky guy died almost a century ago. How is this relevant to me? Oh, it has never been more relevant. Let's look at an example Vygotsky could only have dreamed of, learning something new on the internet. Think about a teenager learning guitar from online videos. They aren't just passively watching. They're posting in forums, getting feedback from strangers, joining communities of other players. Those strangers from halfway across the world are acting as their mentors. The internet has become a massive global zone of proximal development. So let's zoom out and bring this all home. Understanding Vygotsky isn't just some dusty academic exercise. It has huge implications for how we design our schools, how we work together, and even how we view ourselves and our own capacity to grow. In a world that so often screams about individual achievement and pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps, why is this idea of social learning more important than ever? What's the bottom line here? It's this. Vygotsky shows us that learning is a deeply, fundamentally human act. It's about connection, it's about community. To learn something isn't just to download a fact into your brain, it's to join a conversation that's been going on for centuries. To learn is to belong. And I'll leave you with this to think about. If our inner voice is literally built from the voices of others, then we have to ask ourselves a really important question. Whose voices are we letting in? Who are the people, the communities, and the ideas that we're allowing to build the very architecture of our minds? Because the quality of our conversations determines the quality of our thoughts. So, what if school wasn't just preparation for life? What if it was life itself? That was the big, revolutionary idea from John Dewey, a philosopher who basically wanted to completely transform what we think education is for. And that one line right there, that's the key to pretty much everything Dewey believed. For him, learning wasn't some kind of rehearsal for a future event. It was the main event happening, right here and right now. Okay, let's dive into this. See, Dewey was arguing that the entire purpose of school needed a total overhaul. The point isn't to just stock up on information for later. It's all about living more deeply, more intelligently, right here in the present. And this slide really lays out the core conflict he saw. You've got the traditional model on one side, right? It kind of treats students like, empty jars you just fill with facts for some tests down the road. But on the other side, you have Dewey's vision. Students as active problem solvers, using what they learn as a tool to figure out their world today. So, where did all this come from? Well, Dewey's whole approach is rooted in this really American philosophy called pragmatism. And the idea is actually pretty simple, but it's also profound. A thought or a theory, it's only as good as its ability to help us act smarter in the real world. For Dewey, thinking was for doing, period. Okay, so if education is life, then what's at the very heart of it? Well, for Dewey, it's one word, experience. But, and this is a huge but, not just any old experience would do. He had something really specific in mind. And that, of course, brings up a really important question. Is just doing stuff enough to learn? I mean, couldn't some experiences actually be, as he put it, miseducative? Stuff that actually closes you off from growing? Dewey's answer? A big yes. And that led him to make this really critical distinction. And here it is, that key distinction. On one hand, you've got routine experience. This is when you just repeat old habits, kind of mindlessly going through the motions. But then you have reflective experience. This is where you consciously connect what you did with what happened because of it. That is where the real growth is. You see, for Dewey, we don't just learn from experience. We learn from reflecting on that experience. That's the secret sauce. And the really cool thing is, Dewey didn't just leave this as some big, abstract idea. Nope, he actually laid out a method, these 5 steps. I mean, this is basically the scientific method, right? But he applied it to all learning. It's a roadmap for turning confusion into real understanding, basically turning every student into a little scientist, an explorer. All right, so what does a school built on all these ideas actually look like? Yeah, you can forget about those neat rows of desks all facing a chalkboard. Think way more dynamic. Think of a workshop. And this is where the rubber meets the road. This isn't just theory. He went and created an actual laboratory to test his ideas out. In this school, subjects weren't separate things. You learned math by doing carpentry. You learned chemistry by cooking. The whole curriculum was built around real activities that had a social purpose. So let's just picture it. Let's imagine we're in one of these classrooms for a second. The teacher isn't going to start with a boring lecture on engineering principles. Nope. Instead, they just pose a real-world problem. And that challenge itself is what sparks the students' curiosity and gets everything rolling for some genuine discovery. And this is what it all builds to, that aha moment. So after all this hands-on work, building, testing, seeing things fail, and trying again, the students feel the scientific principles for themselves.
The fancy names for the concepts, like tension or compression, they learn those after they've already figured out how it works. The understanding comes first.
This whole process? This is a perfect picture of what Dewey called education through reconstruction of experience. It's this amazing cycle where you do something, you see what happens, and then you think about that connection. And that reflection builds new, stronger knowledge you can use next time. So you can see how this completely flips the teacher's role on its head. They're not the sage on the stage anymore, just handing out facts. Instead, they're more like an architect of discovery. They design the environment, they set up the materials, they ask the right questions, and they guide the students through that whole process of reflection. But for Dewey, this wasn't just about making better scientists or better carpenters. It had a much, much bigger goal, something he felt was truly urgent: building a stronger democracy. See, he was convinced that democracy isn't something you just read about in a civics textbook. It's a set of habits, things you practice every single day. Listening to other people, debating ideas, working together, and taking responsibility as a group. And what better place to practice all of that than in the classroom? Think about it. A project like a community garden, it becomes this perfect little mini version of democratic life. Yeah, the students are using their academic skills, science for the soil, math to figure out growth rates, but they're also having to negotiate, plan together, and connect what they're doing to a real need in their community. It's one living lesson in biology, ethics, and citizenship, all rolled into one. Okay, so at this point, you might be thinking, this all sounds great, but maybe a little idealistic for the real world. Well, the truly amazing thing is that Dewey's ideas, which are over a century old now, are more alive today than ever. I mean, if you've heard of stuff like project-based learning where students work on a big, complex problem for weeks, or makerspaces where kids learn by literally building and inventing things, then you've seen Dewey's legacy right in front of you. All of these modern approaches, service learning, even how some big companies train their employees, you can trace their DNA directly back to Dewey's core idea of learning through guided, reflective experience. So what's the big takeaway here? Ultimately, for Dewey, the goal of school wasn't just to make people smarter. It was to make them more fully human. The real point of education is just continuous growth. It's about widening our ability to see the world from someone else's point of view and to act with what he called intelligent sympathy. And, that leaves us with the exact same challenge Dewey was grappling with more than 100 years ago. In a world that's so often driven by standardized tests and memorizing facts, how do we carve out space for those messy, authentic, real experiences that aren't just getting you ready for life, but that are life itself? So, how do we actually learn something? I mean, how do we go from zero to genuine understanding? Well, a huge part of that answer comes from a guy named Jerome Bruner. Think of him as the ultimate translator, the one who took the super complex science of how we learn and turned it into the practical art of how we should teach. He didn't just watch from the sidelines. He literally drew up the blueprints for modern education. And today, we're going to explore that blueprint. For decades, education had this really simple view of the mind. It was all about stimulus and response. It's kind of like a vending machine, right? You put a coin in, that's the stimulus, and a candy bar comes out. That's the response. The mind itself, it was treated as a total black box. We could see what went in and what came out, but what was happening on the inside, nobody really knew, or honestly, even tried to figure it out. But of course, that black box idea just wasn't good enough for thinkers like Jerome Bruner. He was a major force in what's called the cognitive revolution, a whole movement of people who were basically determined to pry that box wide open. Bruner was like, wait a minute, learning isn't just about reacting, it's an active process. It's about us, making sense of things, building meaning, and organizing the world in our own heads. So our first section is all about that, opening the black box. We're going to look at how Bruner completely changed the game, moving away from just watching behaviors to actually understanding that search for meaning. And this slide really shows you the core of that shift. On one side, you've got the old way, stimulus and response. Super simple, cause and effect, kind of like flipping a light switch. But on the other side, you've got Bruner's whole world, meaning making. This is all about the active, messy, and creative stuff happening inside our minds. And that's the difference, right? It's the difference between training a dog to sit and a child learning why we have rules. This wasn't just a small adjustment, it was a total revolution in how we think about learning.
Okay, next up, let's dive into what I'm calling the blueprint for knowing. This is where we get into his modes of representation, which is basically the foundation for how we turn raw experience into actual knowledge. So Bruner laid out this incredible 3-stage process for how we build knowledge. First, he said, comes the inactive stage. Think action. It's learning by doing. It's all muscle memory. Then comes the iconic stage. Think image. This is learning through pictures, diagrams, and mental images. And finally, we get to the symbolic stage, which is all about abstract stuff like words, numbers, and formulas. The big takeaway here? This progression is totally natural. We always move from the concrete, physical world to the world of abstract ideas. And a perfect everyday example of this is just tying your shoe. Think about it. When you were a little kid, you first learned by someone physically guiding your hands, right? That's inactive, learning by doing. A little later, you could look at a diagram of the loop, swoop, and pull and get it. That's iconic. And now you could read a whole paragraph of written instructions on how to tie a complex knot and understand it perfectly. That's symbolic. Bruner's whole point was that the best teaching should follow this exact path. All right, so with that blueprint as our foundation, Bruner then built his entire educational framework on what we can call 3 pillars of learning. And trust me, these are the core ideas that are still shaping classrooms all over the world today. Pillar number 1 is a big one, discovery learning. Bruner was convinced that we only truly understand something when we uncover it for ourselves. It's not about a teacher just dumping information into your brain. No, it's about getting your hands dirty, wrestling with a problem, and having that aha moment. It's about turning information into your own personal knowledge. And what's so powerful about this is that it doesn't just teach you what to think, it teaches you how to think. And this quote from Bruner himself just nails it. Knowing is a process, not a product. For him, education wasn't some kind of scavenger hunt to collect facts and put them in a box. It was all about getting good at the process of knowing, the active, ongoing journey of figuring things out. Okay, pillar number 2, scaffolding. And this is where teaching really becomes an art. Think about building a house. You need scaffolding to reach the higher floors, right? Well, it's the same in learning. A teacher provides temporary support, maybe a little hint, a leading question, or a worked example to help a student do something they can't quite do on their own yet. But here's the crucial part. Just like with a building, once the structure is strong enough, you take the scaffolding away. It's all about guiding someone toward independence. And that brings us to the 3rd pillar, and this might be his most famous idea of all, the spiral curriculum. Bruner made this absolutely wild claim. He said that any subject can be taught to any child at any stage of development as long as you teach it in an intellectually honest way. So what does that mean? It means you don't just teach a topic once and you're done. You revisit it again and again, spiraling upwards. Each time you come back to it, you tackle it with more complexity and depth. Let's make this real. Take a concept like probability. In 6th grade, you might start by just rolling dice. It's fun, it's hands-on, that's that inactive learning we talked about. A couple years later, in 8th grade, you revisit probability, but now you're connecting it to charts, graphs, and basic statistics. Then, fast forward to 11th grade, and you're using those very same fundamental ideas about probability to analyze super complex algorithms in a computer science class. See? The core topic never changed, but the understanding just kept spiraling up and up to a whole new level. All right, let's bring it all together in our final section, a legacy in spirals. Because this stuff isn't just history, folks. Bruner's blueprint is the living, breathing foundation for so much of how we learn today. And I want you to think about this. You see Bruner's ideas everywhere in your world, probably without even realizing it. Ever used an adaptive AI tutor that gives you a little hint when you're stuck? That's pure scaffolding. Played an educational game where you have to figure out the mechanics yourself? That's discovery learning. And what about those science classes that keep revisiting topics like ecosystems, each time with a little more depth? Yep, that's the spiral curriculum. His ideas aren't just in textbooks. They're in the tech we use and the classes we take. They are literally everywhere. And this last quote just brings everything full circle so perfectly. He said, "We learn best when we discover for ourselves, but never alone." He was the biggest champion for personal discovery, for that aha moment. But he was also a realist. He knew that we need guides, we need teachers, mentors, tools, even just the culture around us to create a space where that discovery can happen. His entire life's work was about finding that beautiful, perfect balance between the two.
Ultimately, Bruner's work was all about building bridges between what we already know and what we're capable of discovering. So I'll leave you with this question to think about. In your own life, whether you're a teacher, a parent, a student, or just a curious person, where can you build a bridge to understanding? Where can you help someone, or maybe even yourself, cross over from just knowing something to truly understanding it?
Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into the mind of a psychological giant, Albert Bandura, to figure out how we learn so much just by watching the world around us.
So let's start with a huge question, one that people have been wrestling with forever. How does all the stuff out there in the world get in here and shape who we become? Are we building ourselves from the inside, or is someone else building us from the outside?
For a long, long time, there were pretty much two main camps on this. You had thinkers like Jean Piaget, who saw us as inner architects, building knowledge from our own blueprints. And then you had others, like Lev Vygotsky, who saw us learning from the social scaffold that other people provide.
But there was a big problem, a huge missing piece of the puzzle. How did that social world, that outside stuff, actually get into our heads and make us do things? There was a massive gap there.
For decades, the theory that ruled the day was behaviorism, and it saw learning as a really simple, almost mechanical process that, kind of ignored the mind altogether.
The idea was pretty straightforward. You do something, you get a direct result, a reward or a punishment, and that shapes what you do next. Super simple, clean, but, as it turns out, totally incomplete. And then, in the 1950s, this psychologist, Albert Bandura, he noticed something that was both incredibly obvious and completely revolutionary, something that this old model just couldn't explain.
He realized that we are constantly learning just by watching other people. We don't always need a direct reward. We see something, we process it, and we learn. He called this observational learning, and it's a huge deal. And he proved it with his famous Bobo doll experiments. So kids who just watched an adult get aggressive with a doll, well, they later copied that exact behavior. This showed that they didn't just learn that aggression was possible, they learned it was an acceptable thing to do in that situation, especially if the adult wasn't punished. Learning wasn't just about what happens to you, it could happen vicariously, through someone else.
Okay, so this was a massive breakthrough, and it led Bandura to map out the very core of his theory. A really dynamic model for how we actually learn from the world around us.
He called it reciprocal determinism. Now, that sounds a little academic, I know, but the idea is actually super intuitive. It means learning isn't a one-way street. It's not just the world acting on you. It's a constant, three-way conversation.
So here's how it works. You've got your personal stuff, your thoughts, your beliefs. Those influence your behavior, right? Your actions. But then, your actions change the environment around you. And guess what? That new environment circles right back and shapes your thoughts and beliefs. It's this continuous feedback loop where we're not just products of our lives, we're also the producers.
But what is the fuel for this whole system? What's the psychological engine that makes us act and learn and keep going even when it's tough? Well, Bandura pinpointed a key ingredient.
He called it self-efficacy. And honestly, this might be his most powerful idea. It's not just about what you can do, your actual skills. It's about what you believe you can do. It's that deep-down conviction that you've got what it takes.
Okay, so if this self-belief is such a game changer, where in the world does it come from? It's not magic. Bandura said there are 4 key sources that build it up piece by piece.
And what's so great about this is how practical it is. First, it comes from your own past successes. He called them mastery experiences. You also get it from seeing other people who are like you succeed. Those are vicarious experiences. It's also built up by encouragement from people you trust, or verbal persuasion. And finally, it comes from how you learn to read your own body. Is that racing heart a sign of fear, or is it a sign of excitement and readiness? That interpretation matters.
Think about it this way. Imagine a quiet student, Maya. She sees a classmate get praised for sharing a cool idea. That's a vicarious experience. So she gives it a shot, and she gets some positive feedback. That's verbal persuasion. Slowly, her belief about herself as someone who can contribute starts to change. And that new belief, it makes her participate even more. You see? It's a constant dance between belief and behavior.
So this isn't just some abstract theory. It has some really profound, real-world uses for how we can take control and learn intentionally.
And this is where it all comes together. Bandura's ideas connect to everything. Self-regulation,
That's you using these concepts to manage your own learning, setting goals, and tracking your progress. Moral agency? That's about making sure your actions line up with your values. And collective efficacy? That's when a whole team gets that "we can do this" feeling and they go on to achieve incredible things together.
So what Bandura really showed us is that we aren't just passive sponges. Learning is this active, social, and conscious process of building who we are. It's the science of becoming ourselves, on purpose.
And that's the final takeaway. Knowing how this all works actually gives you the power to shape your own learning. The people you watch, the feedback you listen to, the beliefs you nurture, it all matters. So think about it. What's the bridge you need to build right now? What is the one belief about yourself that, if you truly, fully embraced it, would change everything for you?
Ever stop and think about how your mind actually works? How it deals with all the stuff thrown at it every single day? Because, it's not just a camera recording everything. Nope, it's more like a master builder, an architect that's actively building your reality from the inside out. So let's pull back the curtain and take a look at this incredible, invisible architecture that our minds are building all the time.
I love this quote from psychologist Frederick Bartlett. It just completely flips the script on how we usually think about memory, right? We have this idea that our brain is like a perfect filing cabinet or a library, just faithfully storing every single thing that happens. But the truth, it's way more interesting, way more dynamic than that. Your mind isn't just storing facts, it's weaving them into a story. It's a storyteller. And that right there, that's the big idea we're going to explore today. Your mind is an architect. Seriously. Every new piece of info you get isn't just filed away somewhere. No way. It's used as a building material. It's used to construct, to reinforce, or sometimes, to tear down and completely rebuild the very frameworks you use to see the world. All right, so let's get into it. We're going to look at the 3 core structures our minds use to build meaning. These are schemas, scripts, and mental models. Okay, first up, schemas. Think of these as the basic foundational blueprints for literally all of our knowledge. They're the absolute bedrock of how we think and how we learn.
So this idea originally comes from the brilliant psychologist Jean Piaget. And a schema is basically a mental shortcut. I mean, think about it. You have a schema for dog, right? It probably includes stuff like, 4 legs, fur, barks, wags its tail. The second you see a new creature with those features, your brain doesn't have to start from square one. It just goes, click, that's the dog.
Okay, so how do these blueprints change and adapt over time? Well, Piaget pointed out 2 key ways. First, there's assimilation. That's the easy one. You see a golden retriever and it fits perfectly into your existing dog blueprint. Simple. But then there's accommodation. And this is where the real deep learning happens. Imagine you're a little kid and you see a tiny chihuahua for the first time. It's still a dog, yeah, but your brain has to actually stretch and change its blueprint to make room for this new kind of weird yapping piece of information.
And this idea of the schema, well, it didn't just stop with Piaget and kids. It grew up, you could say. It evolved all through the 20th century. Bartlett, who we mentioned earlier, he took it and applied it to adult memory. And then later on, you had researchers like Schenck, Abelson, and Johnson-Laird who refined it even more, giving us these really powerful concepts of scripts and mental models, which we're about to get into.
So how do we know this? Well, Bartlett proved it with his really famous study called The War of the Ghosts. Here's what he did. He had a bunch of British people read this really unfamiliar Native American folktale. Then, later, he asked them to recall it. And what happened was amazing. Their memories were not perfect recordings at all. They had unconsciously changed details, smoothed over the weird parts, and basically reshaped the entire story to fit their own cultural blueprints, their own schemas. It's the perfect proof that memory isn't a playback, it's a reconstruction every single time.
All right, so we've got the foundation, the schemas. Now let's look at how we use these blueprints to get through our daily lives.
First up is something called a script, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a schema, but for a sequence of events. Think of it like your brain's pre-planned choreography for all the common situations you find yourself in. And man, does it save you a ton of mental energy.
The classic textbook example is the restaurant script. I mean, think about it. You don't walk into a restaurant and have to figure everything out from scratch, right? Of course not. Your brain just loads up the script. You get seated, you order, you eat, you pay, you leave. It's all on autopilot. And that frees up your brain to focus on the important stuff, like the conversation you're having or, what's good on the menu.
Okay, next up we've got mental models. So if a schema is a blueprint for a thing, like a dog, and a script is a blueprint for a sequence, like going to a restaurant, then a mental model is a working internal simulation of a whole system. It's your mind's way of figuring out how all the different parts of something actually work together.
And this is a really important difference. Schemas help you organize what you know, kind of like a filing cabinet for ideas. But mental models, they help you operate on that knowledge. They're like a flight simulator for reality. You use your mental model of, say, the economy to guess what might happen if interest rates go out. It's your own internal what-if machine, constantly running simulations. So, we've got all these internal structures, schemas, scripts, mental models. But what happens when they're wrong? This is where we get to what I think is the most important part of learning. It's not just about adding new facts. It's about being willing to fundamentally renovate our entire mental architecture.
Think about a little kid. They might have a mental model that says, trees make the wind, right? Because they see the branches waving and the wind blowing. And from their point of view, that makes total sense. Real learning, deep learning, happens when they run into a new, more powerful idea, like air pressure, that forces them to dismantle that old model and build a new, more accurate one. For that kid, the whole way they see the wind has just been completely renovated.
And this, right here, is why misconceptions are so incredibly stubborn. They're not just random mistakes. They're actually the logical conclusions of a flawed but internally consistent mental model. That's why just telling someone a fact usually isn't enough to change their mind. For real change to happen, that old framework has to break. You need a challenge, a kind of intellectual crisis that forces a total rebuild from the ground up.
So researchers like Posner have actually mapped this out. They call it conceptual change. And it goes like this. First, you have to get dissatisfied. Your current model has to fail you in some way. Second, you have to find a new explanation that actually makes better sense. And third, and this is key, you have to see that new concept as not just plausible, but genuinely useful for understanding and dealing with the world.
So look, understanding all this, it's not just a cool psychology lesson. It's a toolkit. It's a user manual for your own brain. It gives you the power to become the architect of your own learning, of your own understanding.
So how do you actually do it? Well, here are a few tools for the toolbox. Don't just passively consume information. Actively try to connect new ideas to what you already know. When you run into something confusing, don't just get frustrated. Stop and ask yourself, okay, why doesn't this fit my current model? Use analogies and visualizations to build stronger frameworks. And every once in a while, take a look at your own automatic scripts and just ask, hey, is this still the best way to do this?
Really, it all comes down to this single idea, which sums up everything we've talked about. Knowledge isn't something we just store away. It's a structure we actively build. Learning isn't about memorizing. It's the continuous, personal, and really creative act of constructing your own mind.
So, I'm going to leave you with a question. Think about a belief you've held for a long time or a way you've always done something. Remember, you are the architect of your mind. So, what part of your mental architecture are you going to renovate next?
You know that feeling? That powerful, kind of uncomfortable feeling you get right before you have a major breakthrough? Well, it turns out that little moment of tension, it's not a roadblock. It's actually the secret ingredient to real, deep learning. Seriously, think about it for a second. Picture that instant where everything just clicks and some new idea finally makes perfect sense. What's the feeling that comes right before that moment of clarity?
Yeah, it's usually discomfort. A sort of mental static, you know? It's when a new piece of information just doesn't line up with what you thought you knew. But here's the amazing part. That tension isn't a sign that you're failing. It is the spark that actually gets the whole learning process started.
So, this productive discomfort, it has a name, and it's basically the engine that drives our understanding forward. It's called cognitive conflict. And the key thing to get here is that this conflict, it's not a bug in our mental software. It's the central feature. It's like our mind's alarm system going off saying, hey, pay attention, we might need to update our files here. It's the friction that literally forces us to grow. I just love this way of putting it because it completely reframes the whole experience. That struggle, that feeling of being stuck, it's not something we should be trying to avoid. It's the very thing that ignites our curiosity and pushes us toward a much deeper, more real understanding of the world.
And you know, this is not some brand new idea. A couple of giants in developmental psychology, Jean Piaget and Lev Vygotsky, were really the first to map out this internal landscape, even though they looked at it from slightly different angles.
So for Piaget, this conflict was a really personal, internal struggle. You have your existing ideas, right? And when new information comes along that doesn't fit, you're forced to either kind of shoehorn it in or, and this is the powerful part, completely change your original way of thinking to make room for it. Vygotsky, on the other hand, he argued that this conflict is often social. It gets sparked when you debate ideas with other people, forcing you to defend, clarify, and maybe even change your own point of view. So for Piaget, the struggle is inside you. For Vygotsky, it's often between you and somebody else.
Okay, so how does all this conflict actually lead to real change? Well, building on those early ideas, modern researchers came up with a pretty neat 4-step framework that explains how we actually go about changing our minds.
So for a new idea to really take hold and replace an old one, it basically has to pass these 4 tests. First, you've got to be dissatisfied with your current belief. You have to see the cracks in it. Second, the new idea has to be intelligible. You have to be able to actually understand what it's saying. Third, it needs to be plausible. It has to feel like it could actually be true. And finally, and this is crucial, it has to be fruitful. It needs to do some work for you, solve old problems, and open up totally new ways of thinking.
All right, enough theory. What does this look like in the real world? Let's walk through a classic classroom example that makes this whole thing really click.
Okay, imagine a teacher asks a super simple question. If you place a steel sewing needle on the surface of some water, will it sink or float? What's your gut reaction?
The immediate assumption for pretty much all of us is, it sinks. I mean, of course it does. Steel is way denser than water. Our mental rulebook is simple. Heavy things sink, end of story.
But then, the teacher very gently places it on the water, and it floats. And that one single observation just shatters the assumption.
That right there, that moment of, wait, what? That is cognitive conflict in action. The thing you see with your own eyes completely smashes your expectation, proving that your old rule, heavy things sink, well, it's not the whole story.
And this is where a great teacher or a cognitive coach is so important. Their job isn't just to give you the answer, it's to guide you through the struggle. First, they get you to state your belief out loud. Then they confront it with that challenging new data. Then, they help you reconstruct your understanding to include new ideas like surface tension. And finally, they help you consolidate that new knowledge so it sticks.
So, what's the big takeaway for us in all of this? It means we need to basically change our relationship with feeling confused or wrong. It's about learning to embrace what a lot of educators call the productive struggle.
When you boil it all down, it comes to this. That mental friction, that's the spark. That feeling of discomfort, that's the engine. And that productive struggle is what makes learning actually last. It's really an invitation to question what you think you know, because real learning isn't just about adding new facts. It's about rebuilding your ideas from the ground up.
So I'll leave you with this to think about. That feeling of discomfort isn't a dead end. It's a signal that you are right on the edge of a breakthrough. So, what long-held assumption or belief are you ready to put to the test?
All right, today we're diving into a skill that can totally change the game for how you learn and solve problems. It's called metacognition, which is really just a fancy way of saying thinking about your own thinking. You know the feeling, right? We've all been there. You get to the bottom of a page, your eyes have definitely scanned every single word, but your brain, well, it's retained absolutely zero. It's that super frustrating moment of zoning out right when you're supposed to be zoning in. Well, it turns out there's a powerful fix for that exact problem.
And that fix is metacognition. See, it's not just about knowing things, it's about knowing how you know them. You can think of it like your mind has its own built-in supervisor, making sure the learning process is actually working. It's the thing that turns learning from something passive into a totally conscious and deliberate act. To really get a handle on this, let's use a pretty simple analogy. Just imagine your mind is a busy company and it's got both a worker and a manager on staff.
So cognition is the worker. It's on the front lines, the one doing the actual work. You know, reading the words, solving the math problem. But metacognition, that's the manager. It's not doing the work itself. Instead, it's overseeing the whole operation, asking those big picture questions like, hey, are we being efficient here? Is this the best strategy? Maybe we should try something else.
And what happens when you have a good manager in charge of your thinking? Well, you become what's called a self-correcting learner. You slowly shift from needing someone else to tell you what to do to becoming your very own guide.
You know, this whole concept isn't exactly new.
Way back in the 1970s, researchers like John Flavel and Anne Brown noticed something really interesting. The most successful learners weren't just smarter, they were more aware of their own learning process. They instinctively knew how to plan an approach, check in on their progress, and, crucially, change course when things weren't working. This big insight is what led Flavel to define the two key parts of metacognition.
So what are those two sides? Metacognitive knowledge and metacognitive regulation. Knowledge is the what. It's knowing yourself as a learner. For instance, realizing, you know what, I'm not great at remembering dates, so I'm going to need to make a timeline. Regulation, on the other hand, is the how. It's the active part, the planning, monitoring, and evaluating while you learn. That's your inner manager, right there in action.
So how do we actually put all of this into practice? Let's go ahead and open up the Metacognitive Toolkit and take a look at the specific strategies you can start using to become a way more effective learner. Okay, so your knowledge toolkit has 3 main layers. Declarative is knowing what. For example, I know I learn best with visual notes. Procedural is knowing how. Okay, to summarize this, first I'll highlight the main ideas. And conditional, well, that's the expert level. It's knowing when and why to use a strategy. This topic is really complex, so a concept map is definitely the best tool here. It's all about picking the right tool for the right job. And you apply all that knowledge using the regulation cycle. This is the active, real-time management of your own learning. Before you even start, you plan. As you're working, you monitor. This is where you catch yourself zoning out. And after you're done, you evaluate. Did that plan actually work? What could I do differently next time? See, it's a continuous loop of improvement.
This all sounds pretty great in theory, but what does metacognition actually look like out in the wild?
Here's a perfect real-world example. Picture a biology student. She's designing an experiment, and she suddenly stops and asks herself, wait, did I control for light exposure? See, she isn't just blindly following a procedure. She's stepping back and monitoring her own process. That question is pure metacognition. It's her catching a potential error before it messes up the entire experiment.
And this skill is not just for science class. In math, it's about explaining why you chose a certain formula. In reading, it's that little pause to ask yourself, okay, do I actually get what I just read? And in writing, it's that absolutely crucial ability to step back and read your own work from someone else's perspective. It's a truly universal skill. And get this, metacognition can even work on a bigger scale. Teams can practice what some people call collective metacognition. That's when the group pauses to reflect on its own process, asking those same manager-style questions to make sure everyone's on the right track and that no important viewpoints are being missed. So what's the big picture payoff for all this self-monitoring? Why is this one of the single most important skills you could ever develop? The ultimate goal comes down to one word: transfer. This is the incredible ability to learn something in one context, let's say a history class, and then successfully apply that learning in a completely different one, like learning new software for a job or even navigating a tricky relationship. Metacognition is really the secret sauce to becoming a true lifelong learner. It's what makes your skills portable, it lets you adapt and grow and build new knowledge in basically any situation you face, long after you've left any classroom. And it actually goes even deeper than that. This isn't just some academic tool. The simple practice of self-examination, of questioning your own assumptions, your own thought processes, that's the foundation for a more thoughtful, more aware, and more responsible life. It's not just about learning how to learn, it's about learning how to live. Ultimately, you can think of metacognition as both a mirror and a light. It's the mirror that lets us see our own minds at work, and it's the light that guides our path forward. It shows us that we aren't just living inside our own understanding. We are its architects, and we have the power to keep building and improving it for the rest of our lives. Today, we're talking about something called situated cognition, and trust me, it's a fascinating idea that might just change how you think about learning forever. I mean, have you ever really thought about this? You pull an all-nighter, you cram for a huge exam, you ace it, and then what? A month later, it's like it all just vanished. Poof. But that one skill you picked up at a summer job, maybe 10 years ago, you can still do it perfectly. How does that even work?
Well, there's actually a name for that super frustrating feeling. It's this gap, a gap between knowing about something, in theory, and actually being able to do it in the real world. I think we've all been there.
Okay, so let's dig into that a little deeper. What exactly is this gap? Why doesn't knowing something automatically mean you can do it? This is the classic example, and it's perfect. Picture a student who's just brilliant at math. On paper, they can solve all these complicated equations, they know the formulas backwards and forwards, but then you ask them to do something practical, like, hey, can you use that math to set up a personal budget? And they're completely lost. It's like all that knowledge is just stuck inside the textbook, it can't escape into the real world. That right there, that's the disconnect we're talking about. So if the traditional classroom is kind of creating this problem, what's the solution? Well, it turns out we need to look at learning where it actually happens, out in the wild. And the answer is this incredible theory called situated cognition. The main idea is actually pretty simple, but it's also really profound. It says that real learning isn't just about, downloading facts into your brain. It's about actually participating in an activity. The theory argues that what you know is completely tied up with where you know it and how you use it. And here's where it gets really interesting, because this idea completely flips the script on how we usually think about school. We're taught to see our minds as these hard drives, right? Just storing up abstract information. But this situated view says, nope, that's not it at all. Knowledge isn't just data. It's a practice. You're not supposed to be a spectator just watching. You're meant to be a participant right in the middle of it all. Now, this isn't some newfangled idea that just popped up. It actually builds on the work of some real giants in the field. Way back, you had thinkers like John Dewey and Lev Vygotsky who were already saying, hey, our environment and our culture are part of how we think. Then, in the 90s, Jean Lave and Etienne Wenger really nailed it down and gave us this amazing concept to wrap our heads around it. And this quote, this is the one that really changes the game. Learning is not merely the acquisition of knowledge, but legitimate participation in a community of practice. Whoa. So it's not just about grabbing facts. It's about becoming a real, participating member of a group that actually does the thing you're trying to learn. The best way to think about it? It's basically an apprenticeship. Let's take the classic example of an apprentice tailor. Think about it. They don't show up on day one and get a textbook on sewing theory. No way. They start on the outside, looking in. What's called the periphery. They're sweeping floors, yeah? But they're also listening to how the master tailors talk. They're absorbing the whole culture of the shop. Then, maybe they get a small, low-stakes task, like sewing on a button. And slowly but surely, they move from the edge right into the center, until they're a full participant. They're learning by doing, completely immersed in the real context. Okay, that's the big picture. But how does this actually work inside our heads? Or maybe outside our heads? Let's get into the mechanics of it all, the mind, the body, and, believe it or not, the crew. First up, this idea of embodied cognition. And that's exactly what it sounds like. It argues that thinking isn't just something that happens in your brain. It's physical. You know how we talk with our hands? We're not just being expressive, we're literally helping our brains form the thoughts. Or how you really learn a new route by actually walking or driving it? That's your body being part of the thinking process. It's not just a taxi for your brain. But wait, it gets even wilder. The theory says thinking isn't just in your head and in your body, it's also spread out all over your environment. It's in your tools, it's in the notes you scribble down, it's even in the conversations you have with your team. This is called distributed cognition, and there is an absolutely perfect study that shows exactly how this works. So this anthropologist, Edwin Hutchins, he boards a huge naval vessel, and his question is simple. Who on this ship actually knows how to navigate it? He talks to everyone, observes everything, and the conclusion he came to was mind-blowing. The answer was no one. Not a single person on that entire ship had all the knowledge required to navigate it stored in their head. So if no one person knew how to do it, where was the mind that was navigating this giant ship? Well, it was everywhere at once. It was in the way the crew communicated with each other, it was built into the physical navigation tools, it was in the charts, the manuals, the standard procedures that had been built up over years. The entire system was the mind. The people, the tools, the rules, all of it thinking together. The system itself was the brain. And this leads to a really powerful shift in thinking. You know the old saying, practice makes perfect? Well, situated cognition takes it a step further. Practice doesn't just make perfect. Practice makes the person. This isn't just some abstract theory for a textbook. It's about how the things we do day in and day out literally shape who we are.
Let's look at a flight simulator. When a pilot is in there, they're not just sitting around memorizing abstract theories about lift and drag from a textbook. No, they are learning performance. They are learning how to do the thing. And this is exactly why it's so effective. Those skills transfer almost perfectly to a real cockpit. Why? Because the learning was situated. It took place in a context that was designed to be as close to the real thing as possible. The pilot was learning to integrate everything at once, what they see, what they think, and what they do. And it's not just about hard skills either. Let's take another example, a design studio. There's something much deeper going on here than just learning how to use software. What's really being transferred is identity. Think about it. By actually working on real projects, by getting into those critiques of each other's work, by using the real tools of the trade, these students aren't just learning the principles of design. They start talking like designers. They start thinking like designers. Pretty soon, they start seeing themselves as designers. The learning has literally changed their identity. So all of this brings us to the big finale, the main takeaway. If learning is all about participation and practice and even identity, then what does that really mean for the role of context in all this? You see, we tend to think of our surroundings, the classroom, the office, the workshop, as just the backdrop. It's the stage where the learning show happens. But that's completely wrong. It is so much more than that. It's the actual substance. Context is the clay that knowledge is molded from. The situation isn't just part of the learning, the situation is the learning. That, right there, is the heart of situated cognition. So I want to leave you with one final question to think about. If learning is really just about participating in the world around you, what are you learning right now without even realizing it? What skills, what habits, what parts of your identity are you absorbing just from the groups you hang out with and the places you spend your time? What are you learning simply by living your life? Hey everyone, today we're diving into a really powerful idea. Something that's like a secret blueprint for learning. It's a method that can masterfully guide pretty much anyone from being a complete beginner to a confident expert. So let's get right into it. It's really the biggest question in all of education, isn't it? How does this actually happen? We've all been there, right? Staring at some complex problem or a new skill, just wondering, how on earth am I going to get from point A, where I know nothing, to point Z, where I've actually mastered this thing? Well, you can think of the whole journey of learning as a move from dependence to independence. On one side, you've got the learner who needs constant guidance, just to get by, and on the other, you have someone who can totally stand on their own 2 feet. But what about that huge space in between? How do we build the bridge to get from one side to the other? This quote just nails it. The teacher, or really any mentor, isn't just a walking encyclopedia of information. No, they're more like a construction expert. They build a temporary structure to help the learner cross that huge gap, and, this is just as important, they know exactly when it's time to take it all down. Okay, so like any good construction project, this one starts with a solid plan. So before we see this stuff in action, we really need to understand the blueprint, the theory behind this powerful idea of supported learning. Let's start with the construction site itself. A psychologist named Lev Vygotsky called it the zone of proximal development, or ZPD for short. Just think of it as this magic sweet spot for learning. It's that fertile ground where a task is a little too hard to do all by yourself, but it's perfectly achievable if you have the right help. And this is exactly where scaffolding comes in. Scaffolding is the set of tools, that temporary framework that a teacher uses within that learning zone. And just like the scaffolding on a building, it is not meant to be permanent. It's just there to provide support exactly when it's needed, which allows the real structure, the learner's own skill, to be built. Now, this isn't some brand new idea. It's actually one that's been built on from decades. Vygotsky laid the foundation way back in the 30s. Then in the 70s, researchers gave it that perfect name, scaffolding. And by the 80s, it got refined into the really practical model that we're about to check out. So, all that history brings us to the actual construction process itself. It's a beautifully simple 4-step framework called the gradual release of responsibility. This is how you take all that theory and actually put it into practice. So it works like this. First, it's I do. The teacher demonstrates the skill and, this part is crucial, explains their thinking out loud. Then it's we do. The teacher and the students work on it together, as a team. Next, you do together, where students collaborate in small groups, helping each other out. And finally, you do alone. The support is totally gone, and the student can do it all by themselves. You see, it's not just some random method. It's like this visible, intentional dance between the teacher and the learner. Every single step is designed to hand over ownership and confidence, little by little, until the learner is totally ready to take the lead.
Okay, so that's the blueprint. But what does this construction project actually look like out in the real world? Let's walk through a really concrete example.
Okay, imagine a writing class. The teacher starts by writing a paragraph on the board, and she's explaining her word choices as she goes. That's the I do. Then, the whole class reads one together, with students shouting out ideas. That's the we do. Next, students break into small groups to write their own paragraphs. And finally, each student writes one completely by themselves. You can just see the responsibility shifting perfectly at each stage.
But here's what's so interesting. The most powerful tool for scaffolding isn't always a worksheet or a fancy demonstration. It's just conversation. Yep, the right kind of language can build understanding like absolutely nothing else.
So instead of just giving the answers, a great scaffolder asks questions. Questions like these. See, they don't give away the solution. They actually prompt the learner to find it themselves. They push the hard thinking work away from the teacher and back onto the student, where it belongs. And here is the real goal. When a teacher consistently asks these kinds of questions, the student eventually starts asking them of themselves. That external conversation slowly becomes an internal voice of reasoning and self-correction. And that, right there, is the whole point.
So this brings us to the long-term impact. What's actually left after all that scaffolding is taken down? Well, it's a lot more than just a new skill. Scaffolding actually works on two different levels. Cognitively, yeah, it simplifies the task so the learner's brain doesn't get totally overwhelmed. But just as importantly, it provides emotional support. It builds what psychologists call self-efficacy, that deep-seated belief that, hey, I can do this. It keeps frustration at bay and builds real confidence. Of course, the real artistry here is knowing exactly when to step back. You remove the support too early, and the learner falls flat. But if you leave it up for too long, they can become dependent on it. It's a really delicate balance of watching and listening. And you know, there's a moral dimension to this too. When a teacher or a mentor removes a scaffold, they're sending a really powerful message. They're saying, I trust you. I believe you can do this on your own. It's a profound act of respect for the learner's potential. This quote just gets right to the heart of it all. The ultimate goal of any great teacher or parent or leader is to basically work themselves out of a job. It's this beautiful paradox. Your success is measured by how little you are needed in the end. So, in the end, the real legacy of good scaffolding isn't the structure you built for someone. It's the strong, independent, and confident structure they were able to build for themselves because you were there. That's the part that lasts forever. And that leaves us with one final thought to chew on. Think about your own journey of learning, whether it's in your career, a hobby, or just life. What's a scaffold that was recently removed for you, something that proved you were ready to stand all on your own?
All right, let's dive right in. Today we're going to tackle a huge question. What's the real connection between the words we use and the thoughts we actually have?
I mean, seriously, have you ever stopped to think about that little voice? The one that's always going, planning your day, wrestling with a problem, just narrating your life? Where does that even come from? Is that thought itself? Is it language? Or something else entirely?
So here's the core idea we're going to explore. Language isn't just a microphone for our thoughts, expressing ideas that are already perfectly formed. No, it's more like the actual scaffolding. It's the structure we use to build our consciousness, brick by brick.
And this, of course, brings us to a classic debate in psychology. A real chicken or egg showdown. What comes first, thought or language? Two of the heaviest hitters in the field had very different ideas about this. First up, we've got Jean Piaget. For him, thought was the undisputed champion. He believed that kids figure out the world first by doing things, by touching, playing, and experiencing. Language, in his view, just comes along later. It's an outgrowth, a way to put a label on the mental maps they've already created.
But then you have Lev Vygotsky, and he just flipped that whole idea on its head. He argued that language isn't the result of thinking, it's the catalyst. It's this incredibly powerful psychological tool that our culture gives us, and it literally transforms how we see and understand everything.
And you can see the tension right here. For Piaget, a kid starts out thinking out loud, that's egocentric speech, and then learns to socialize it. For Vygotsky, it's the total opposite. We start by hearing social speech all around us, and then we internalize it, turning it into our own private inner voice. So really, the question is, does our internal thought become social, or does social language become our internal thought?
So, who is right? Well, modern thinking has a really cool answer. What if it's not a competition? What if they were both onto something? It's not a straight line. It's something way more dynamic.
And boom, here it is, the big aha moment. It's a feedback loop. Our basic thoughts allow us to grasp language, but then that new language immediately turns around and reshapes our thoughts, making them more complex. They literally build each other up in this never-ending cycle.
The psychologist Jerome Bruner took this even further. He said, you know what? We don't just think in logical facts. The human mind's natural language is story. Narrative is how we make sense of everything, how we organize time, understand why things happen, and figure out our place in the world.
Okay, so this isn't just some abstract theory. Language is a practical, powerful, super tool that we are using every single second to build our own reality.
This is just a perfect illustration of what I mean. A kid sees a pot of boiling water and thinks, the water is angry. But then you teach them words like temperature, energy, and vaporization. All of a sudden, their entire perception shifts. The water didn't change, but their language did. And with it, their whole understanding deepened. New words literally give you new eyes.
And this brings us right back to Vygotsky's killer concept of inner speech. That's the voice in your head. It's what happens when all that social language you hear out in the world gets turned inward, becoming the very tool you use to reason with yourself.
And that inner speech, that's the engine for something incredible called metacognition, which is just a fancy way of saying thinking about thinking. Every time you plan your next move or ask yourself, wait, is this making sense? Or even just tell yourself to calm down, focus. That's you, using language as a remote control for your own mind.
This goes for writing, too. The simple act of putting your thoughts down on paper makes them real. It makes them tangible. It's like you're pulling them out of your head so you can look at them. Just like this person realized with their journal, sometimes writing down why you're confused is the very first step to finding clarity.
So if language is busy shaping our individual minds, it only makes sense that it's also shaping our collective worlds, our cultures, our shared reality.
Which brings us to a really fascinating, almost sci-fi question that linguists have wrestled with. Does the language you happen to speak actually change the way you physically perceive the world?
Well, the evidence says, yeah, it absolutely does. It guides what you pay attention to. If your language gives gender to objects, like a bridge is masculine in German, it might subtly change how you feel about bridges. Or get this, some languages don't use left and right. They use north, south, east, and west. Imagine how that would hardwire your brain's internal GPS. But the most profound part is this. If you don't have a name for something, it is incredibly difficult to even notice it exists.
And this connects language directly to power. The philosopher Paulo Freire saw this so clearly. He said that literacy is liberation, because the ability to name your experience, to put words to what is happening, is the absolute first step toward gaining the power to change it.
So, what's the big takeaway for us in our day-to-day lives? How do we take all this powerful knowledge and actually apply it?
Well, the crucial insight is this. If you want to think better, clearer, more complex thoughts, the most direct way to do it is to consciously and deliberately expand your language. They're two sides of the very same coin.
So let's just quickly recap the main points. 1. Language is for thinking, not just talking. 2. Thought and language are in a constant feedback loop, building each other up. 3. Learning a new word isn't just trivia. It can literally change how you see the world. And 4. That inner voice you have is your most powerful tool for self-reflection and control.
So we'll leave you with this final thought. If every word you learn is a brick, and every story you tell is a blueprint, that means you are the architect of your own reality. So the only question left is, what are you going to build next?
You know, we have this image of a learning, right? It's you, a book, a quiet room, a solo mission. But what if that's not the whole story? Today, we're going to dig into a much more powerful idea that real, deep understanding isn't found in isolation. It's actually forged in that dynamic, sometimes chaotic space between people. So let's just jump right in with a question that kind of flips everything on its head. We've spent so long idolizing the lone genius, right? Well, this idea challenges that whole model. It sets the stage for something way more interesting, the incredible power of collective intelligence. It's because learning, when you get right down to it, is a team sport. It's not a spectator event. It's this interactive social thing where we're constantly pushing, pulling, and building on each other's ideas. And this right here, this flips the old way of thinking completely on its head. The core idea is that knowledge isn't something you just absorb like a sponge. Nope, it's something you build. And where does the building start? The very first draft of a great idea almost always happens in the conversation between minds. It's only after that back and forth that we can go back and really refine it in our own heads. Now, this isn't some new, trendy idea. Not at all. It's actually built on a really solid foundation of psychological and educational theory. So let's take a look at some of the heavy hitters who figured out why learning together works so well. I mean, we're talking about giants in the field. You've got Lev Vygotsky, who argued that social interaction isn't just part of learning, it's where learning begins. Then there's John Dewey. He pictured classrooms as these little democracies, these miniature societies where we practice thinking together. And of course, Albert Bandura, who showed us something we all kind of know intuitively. We learn a ton just by watching other people. Okay, and this brings us to Vygotsky's most famous idea, and it's brilliant. It's called the zone of proximal development. Just think of it as the ultimate learning sweet spot. It's that space where something is a little too hard for you to do all by yourself, but you can totally do it with a little guidance or support from a peer. The cool part? In a group, everyone is constantly creating this zone for each other. It's like a web of support. All right, so we've established that learning together works, but how you actually do it matters a lot. We tend to throw around the words cooperative and collaborative like they're the same thing, but they're not. And the difference between them is actually super important and kind of fascinating. So here's the breakdown. Think of cooperative learning like a well-rehearsed orchestra. It's super structured. You have assigned roles, you play the violin, I'll handle percussion. Everyone has a specific part to play to create the final piece. Now, collaborative learning, that's more like a jazz trio. It's messy, it's emergent. The group finds its way together, riffing off each other. The magic is in that spontaneous back and forth, creating something brand new right there on the spot. Let's make this real. To see just how powerful this can be, let me tell you a quick story about this thing called the geometry circle. So a teacher goes into her classroom, but instead of just giving a definition, she draws a shape on the board and asks one simple question. Is this a rhombus? And what happens next is just pure collaboration in action. One student jumps in. Yeah, the sides are all equal. But then another student pushes back. Wait, but look at the angles. They're not right. And they offer a counterexample. This is what's called exploratory talk. The conversation is the lesson. They're literally thinking out loud together. And the results? It's incredible. Through all that debate and discussion, the students themselves, they co-create a definition of a rhombus that's actually better, more precise, more nuanced than the one printed in their textbook. They didn't just get the information handed to them, they built it from the ground up. Okay, that all sounds great in theory, but let's be real. We've all been in that one terrible group project, right? The one where one person does all the work. So how do you make this stuff actually work in the real world? Well, lucky for us, some researchers have literally given us the blueprint. Two researchers, David and Roger Johnson, figured out there are 5 key ingredients. This is basically the secret sauce to avoid those group project nightmares. It all starts with what they call positive interdependence, this idea that you sink or swim together. Then you need individual accountability, face-to-face interaction, you gotta have social skills, and finally, group processing, which is just taking a moment to reflect on how you're actually working as a team. So let's zoom in on the first two, because they're the real power couple here. Positive interdependence creates that we sink or swim together vibe. But, and this is so important, individual accountability makes sure no one can just hide in the background and let everyone else do the work. You can't just ride on someone's coattails. See that? It's this perfect tension. You need the group goal, but you also need everyone to pull their own weight. But of course, making this all happen isn't as simple as just throwing people into a group and saying, go. It takes a real shift, a shift in the role of the teacher, the tools we use, and we have to be super aware of the common traps people fall into.
First off, the teacher's role completely changes. You know, they have to move away from being the sage on the stage, the person at the front with all the knowledge. Instead, they become the guide on the side. Their job isn't to give answers, it's to design a great task, ask really good questions to push the thinking, and basically just facilitate the conversation.
And look, this isn't always easy. There are definitely some pitfalls. I think the biggest mistake people make is just assuming that if you put people in a group, they'll magically collaborate. They won't. You actually have to teach the skills. Like, how do you disagree with someone respectfully? How do you make sure one or two loud voices don't dominate the whole conversation? It all comes down to intentional design. And this is where technology can be a huge help, right? I mean, tools like Google Docs, Padlet, virtual whiteboards, they can extend this collaborative space beyond the four walls of a classroom. You can build knowledge together even when you're not in the same place at the same time. But here's the catch. The tech is just a tool. You still need a person, a facilitator, to build that sense of community and turn what could be just simple connectivity into real collaboration.
You know, when you get right down to it, what makes this whole approach so powerful isn't just that it helps you learn better, it's the emotional side of it. There's this idea, which really echoes the work of John Dewey, that the joy of shared success, that feeling of, we did it, that's a reinforcement, a motivator that's way more powerful than any grade on a report card. And that really brings us full circle, back to where we started. This is the big idea, the main takeaway from all of this. Intelligence isn't some solitary spark of genius that happens inside one person's head. It's more like a fire that we all build together, piece by piece. It is a shared construction. So, what's the big takeaway here? Well, it's that this isn't just about schools or classrooms. Not at all. Think about your job, your community projects, even your family. The real question for all of us is, how can we start to move away from this myth of the lone genius and start intentionally building more spaces for this kind of shared construction in our own worlds? Something to think about. Thanks for joining me. Welcome. So we're about to dive into a really fascinating idea, the human need to build knowledge. That's totally universal, but the way we actually do it, well, that's incredibly diverse. We're going to find out how our cultures hand us completely different blueprints for how we learn. So let's just start with a big question to kind of frame everything. Is the process of learning truly the same for a child in Tokyo, a teenager in Toronto, and an elder in a Mayan village? You might be surprised by the answer. Okay, so at the heart of all of this is a theory called constructivism. And put simply, it just means we aren't empty buckets waiting for someone to pour information in. Nope, we are active builders. We construct our own understanding of the world, like brick by brick, through every single experience we have. But, and this is the crucial twist, that whole building process doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens inside a culture. And that culture provides the blueprint, the tools, and even the architectural style for this entire structure we call knowledge. This brings us right to our first big idea, the cultural toolkit. I want you to think of culture as this toolbox that we're all handed at birth, and it's full of things that shape how we think and how we learn. Yeah, I love this quote. It just perfectly captures the idea that you can't pull learning apart from its cultural environment. One simply can't exist without the other. It's the water the fish swims in, you know? So what's in this toolkit? Well, a theorist named Lev Vygotsky pointed out some of these key instruments that shape our thinking. We're talking about things like the language we speak, the symbols we use, our art, our rituals, and our technology. We first learn how to use these tools by interacting with others, and then, eventually, we internalize them as our own personal ways of making sense of the world. Okay, so how does this actually play out in the real world? Let's explore how having different cultural toolkits can lead to fundamentally different ways of knowing and learning. You know, one of the biggest dividers you'll see is this orientation toward individualism versus collectivism. So individualist cultures often really value personal discovery, having your own opinion, even debating things. Collectivist cultures, on the other hand, might prioritize group consensus and shared understanding. And listen, neither one is better. They're just different operating systems for constructing knowledge. And this table just illustrates the difference perfectly. Imagine a science class in Canada. You might see every student running their own separate experiment to test their own unique idea. Now, in a Japanese classroom, you're much more likely to see the entire group observing one single demonstration, then discussing it together until everyone is on the same page, and then writing down a shared conclusion. It's the same principle, active learning, but it's a completely different social choreography.
So take a second and think about it. Which one of those classrooms feels more familiar to you, based on your own experience? Your answer probably says a lot about the cultural toolkit you grew up with.
And you know, it's not just about what happens in a school building. A researcher named Barbara Rogoff introduced this really powerful concept she calls guided participation. In many indigenous communities, learning isn't some separate activity you do at a desk. It happens by doing, by weaving alongside an elder or farming with your family. Knowledge gets constructed through direct, meaningful contributions to the life of the community.
So what happens when all these different approaches start colliding in our super interconnected world? Let's take a look at learning in this global age.
This is where we run into a major challenge. When educational models from one culture are just kind of dropped into another without any changes, they can create a lot of friction. For example, a teaching method that encourages you to openly debate and question your teacher might be seen as deeply disrespectful in a culture that really values group harmony and reverence for elders. See the problem?
But when it's done right, oh man, the results are incredible. Check out this case study from India. Instead of using abstract foreign examples, teachers use the traditional weaving patterns from their own village to teach geometry. All of a sudden, these abstract concepts like angles and ratios were grounded in the students' actual daily lives and their cultural heritage. That is culturally responsive constructivism in action. So smart.
And of course, technology is just pouring gasoline on this fire, creating a new kind of global constructivism. I mean, think about it. When a student in Kenya collaborates on a climate change project with kids in Finland and Brazil, they're not just learning science. They're actively building a shared understanding by figuring out how to navigate different communication styles, different priorities, and totally different worldviews.
And this is a really crucial point. For many communities, this isn't just some educational theory in a textbook. It's a form of liberation. It's about reclaiming the right to decide what knowledge is important and how it should be passed on, instead of just adopting models from former colonial powers. It's really about honoring their own history and their own values.
Okay, so let's zoom back out and start to bring all this together. With all this wonderful diversity, are there any common threads that run through all of it?
And it turns out, yes, there are. Across all of these different approaches, 4 universal pillars seem to pop up again and again. We see that real learning always requires active engagement. We learn by doing. It's always social. It comes from our relationships with others. It gets deeper through reflection, and it's almost always connected to some kind of greater purpose, whether that's about personal growth or the good of the whole community.
This is honestly the perfect metaphor to sum up everything we've talked about. Those 4 principles, they're the universal skeleton of learning, but it's culture that gives it the unique flesh, the blood, and the heartbeat that truly brings it to life.
And this is exactly why the most essential skill for any educator, or really any learner, in the 21st century is cultural intelligence. It's that ability to recognize these different heartbeats and adapt. It's understanding that the exact same behavior can mean different things in different places, and then being able to teach and learn effectively across those divides. Ultimately, the greatest insight from constructivism isn't just that we build knowledge, but that we always build it together inside these beautiful and endlessly varied cultural architectures. And so, we'll leave you with this question to think about. In our schools, in our workplaces, in our communities, how can we design learning that doesn't just tolerate, but truly honors every single one of these cultural architectures? Thanks for exploring this with us today.